Hello, and welcome to our podcast on the second wave of legal implications of the coronavirus. We call it the second wave as we know many of our HR listeners have already created an initial set of policies in response to this unprecedented crisis. As the situation evolves, new challenges are emerging rapidly that we need to take into account as we put these policies into action and modify them. My name is Adam Bruniger. I lead client solutions at Exec Online. For those who may be unfamiliar, Exec Online provides virtual online leadership development programs in partnership with elite business schools such as Stanford, Columbia, Wharton, and Yale. Now, the stars of the show today are two guests who will help us make sense of this rapidly evolving situation. Expert advice is what is most needed at this time, and we have brought together both a prominent CHRO and a prominent labor and employment lawyer to provide us with a view of the employee ramifications of COVID-19 that you can only get by having both perspectives in the room at the same time. So first, let me introduce Jason Schwartz, who is a litigation partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, co-chair of the Labor and Employment Practice Group and general counsel of the law firm. Jason has been named to the top 100 list of the nation's most powerful employment attorneys by Human Resource Executive magazine. Welcome, Jason. And now let me introduce Melody Jones. Melody is the former Chief Administrative Officer of CEB and a member of Exec Online's Distinguished Advisory Board. She is the founder of 3280 Advisors and also serves on the board of numerous organizations. Welcome, Melody. We are going to be packing quite a bit of information into this podcast. We hope you will find it insightful and actionable.
I just wanted to outline for you here. These are some of the major legal topics that CHROs and employment lawyers are talking about now on a constant basis. We have a Gibson Dunn client alert that we put out that goes through each of these issues and the frequently asked questions, many of which we'll get to today, some of which we won't, but you'll get a link to that client alert as well, and you can read through these issues and some of the questions that come up.
Great. Thank you, Jason. So I want to get into the question and answer session. And the way that we'll do this is, for the first question, Jason, it'd be great if you kind of take this first, and then Melody, if you can jump in, and I'll, as we go through them, we'll kind of switch that up a little bit. But let me start broadly. So what are employers, based on everything that you've seen, kind of currently doing to respond, to all of this?
Yeah, boy. Well, that's a that's a big question, Adam. I think, let me start with, I think there are three buckets that this falls into. Number one, I think everybody is looking at what do they need to do to protect the health and safety of their employees, of their customers, and the broader community. So in that bucket, I would put things like social distancing, working remotely, staggered shifts, all kinds of changes in operation, increases in hygiene in the workplace, those types of things that you'd put in the safety and health bucket. Number two, I would say, are issues that people are looking at in order to maintain service to their clients and customers. There's some overlap with bucket number one there, but I think that it's a distinct issue, and that is, what can we do to maintain operations as best we can during this very unusual and difficult circumstance. And then the third and final area I'd say is responsive to your question, what are people doing, is long-term planning. In a situation where we don't really know how long this is going to last and what its course will be, many businesses are trying to make thoughtful, responsible decisions about how this is going to affect their long-term operations. Unfortunately, some are forced to look at things like the WARN Act and shutting down plants and facilities. And so those type of questions I would put in that third category.
Yeah, I would agree with all that, Jason. That's what I think we're seeing most of. I would just add or amplify to the first point. We're seeing really an unknown to this date, even in 9/11. We're seeing an unknown till now level of flexibility. Employers are really stepping up to just, get out there in front of it and to figure out where at all possible work from home arrangements, to Jason's point, flexible shifts, etc. And they're doing it, quickly. They're not dragging their heels. I think they really are putting employee and broader community safety first and figuring out, obviously to the future planning point Jason just made, everybody wants to keep in contact with their customers, with their constituencies, and to be sure that they're doing all they can, whatever their business line is, to serve them as effectively as they can in this, just like what you guys are doing at Exec Online, for example. And they're coming up with really creative ways to ensure service levels stay up, and flexibly so, even though employees are mostly, to the extent, as I said, possible, not physically in offices around the country, around the world at this point. I think we probably all saw in the news this morning, the luxury brand holding company has Givenchy and some of the others. I always get the initials backwards, but like LMVH, LMHV, at any rate, they make perfumes, and they are switching their entire perfume manufacturing line to making. So it's that, incredibly rapid creativity in face of some very difficult times that I think people are going to remember when everything settles down.
Yeah. Yeah, those are, great starting point for our conversation. And one thing that we hear a lot about and really kind of curious to get your take on as we sort of look at these different buckets of responses that you're seeing is also just around, the uncertainty of coronavirus, just in the sense of, we're not sure. Not everyone has been tested at this point, and so, as we sort of think about, health and safety, for example, we're not sure who's sick, who's not sick. There's a lot of uncertainty around, the spread of coronavirus, around, who's got it, all of those things. How is that playing into the responses, or how should organizations be thinking about, those different buckets with respect to all of that uncertainty out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, first of all, from a safety standpoint, employers need to look at the latest guidance from the CDC, from OSHA, from local health authorities. As you see, it's literally changing on a day-to-day, if not hour-by-hour basis. So you want to be looking to those resources and following their guidance. But on top of that, I think there's lots of confusion about what employers can and cannot ask, and so it's probably worth at least talking about some basics, right? You can certainly ask your employees if they have been to any affected regions, any of the places in the world that the CDC has labeled at higher risk. Have they traveled to those places? You see now orders applying to courthouses and other public buildings where people who have traveled to those places are literally not permitted to enter the building. So as an employer, you're certainly in a position where you can ask your employees and your visitors whether they fall in that criteria. And if they have, then you could tell them that, that they're not going to be able to come onto the premises. You can also ask whether people have been exposed to persons known to have the virus, someone in their household, for example, or someone else to whom they've been exposed. And similarly, in that case, you can follow the public health guidance and ask them to self-quarantine or at least not enter the workplace for a 14-day period. In addition, you can ask your employees if they're suffering symptoms that are consistent with the coronavirus or if they feel like they're sick, and you can send them home on that basis. There is the first place where we're really getting into what you might think of as health information. There is a need to ask the question in order to protect them and protect everybody else in the workplace. So you can ask it, but you have to keep the information as confidential as you can. So, for example, if somebody is diagnosed in the workplace, you're going to want to tell their coworkers that they've been exposed, but somewhat awkwardly, you're not allowed to tell them the name of the person who was infected. So, somebody on the 8th floor has been diagnosed with the coronavirus. We wanted to let you know. and you should get guidance from your healthcare provider about what to do. So those are questions you can ask. The one area where you can't really ask, you have to wait for people to volunteer, is whether they are particularly susceptible or at risk. Somebody who may have underlying conditions that make them more at risk, they may self-disclose, and if they do, then you ought to accommodate them to the extent it's reasonable, but and keep their information confidential. But you shouldn't go out and affirmatively ask people. Let them come to you to disclose that information if they choose to do so.
And I think to a couple things that brings to mind for me, Jason, I think it's important, like in the conversation with employees, if someone if they have been exposed, everybody's going to start guessing. Well, if it was on the 8th floor and it was between these hours, then it must have been Johnny. And I think it's really important for everybody to remember that you cannot give any clues whatsoever. Your face has to remain expressionless. You, in no way overtly or covertly, and you get into potentially disclosing who it is, that then you're on shaky ground. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's very important. The other medical inquiry question that may come up more, many of you probably know, for example, in Singapore, they have a practice now where everybody's temperature is taken regularly in the workplace. We're not seeing a whole lot of that here yet, although some. And I think there is guidance, and if you look at our white paper, for example, there are some citations to it. There is guidance that permits that sort of medical inquiry or medical testing in the workplace where it's necessary to protect other people. So I think we may see more and more of that, although it goes to Adam's point that even somebody who is not showing a fever may in fact be carrying the virus. So it's not a perfect measure. You shouldn't feel safe if everybody in the workplace has a normal temperature, but it is something that employers are beginning to look at, and we may see more of. What I would say again is you really ought to follow the guidance of the public health authorities. If they're telling you, in your circumstance or in your community that that's advisable, then that's something that there certainly is support in the employment law guidance for you to do that in this kind of extraordinary circumstance.
Yeah, it's so important. And the other thing to, jump on a couple of other things you said, Jason, I think, you referenced people doing a good job of planning ahead. And I think, there's a lot of nuance here and a lot of subtleties. You want to be sure that what you're doing in the heat of the moment doesn't set precedent that you don't want to set in a more normalized set of circumstances. So in addition to following all of the good CDC, OSHA guidelines, it is really important to have great employment counsel around in real time around what you're thinking of doing so that someone like Jason can give you implications of that down the road. That was one thing that your commentary triggered, Jason. I think the second is that as you're thinking about accommodations, it's also important not to assume or discriminate, even if you're doing it for all the best reasons, based on your assumption of, say, everyone over a certain age. I think that might be important to do a double click on, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there may be a tendency at this point, sort of in the interest of quote unquote protecting employees, to assume that older employees or employees who you might think have some sort of pre-existing condition should be sent home or should be dealt with in a different way. And that may be the case, but you need to have an individual conversation and sort of open the door for them to come to you to make those requests so that you can consider what makes sense. But it shouldn't be the case that you decide as an employer, I'm going to treat all of the older workers differently, or all of those who I think might be sick with an underlying condition, that is not sick with the virus, but sick with an underlying condition. I'm going to treat them in a certain way. You really need to have them engage with you, let you know what they think they need, and then you can make decisions together. And then as to Melody's point, I think it's extraordinarily important that you're very careful about the precedent. There are already, it amazes me, but there already are people who are writing about this, that, hey, well, now that all these companies have shown that working from home is something that they can do, this is really going to undermine their arguments in legal cases later where they claim they can't accommodate people with working from home. First of all, I think, we all have better things to do right now in the middle of a national emergency than, be focused on how we're going to use this against people later. But what I would say to that is I think Melody's point is incredibly important. When you make these kinds of decisions where we have this really extraordinary flexibility and this extraordinary circumstance that we've never faced before, you want to make clear that these are decisions that are temporary and are made based upon the emergency nature of the situation. So in other words, when we're saying to a large segment of the workforce, you can work from home, you can work remotely, and we're going to facilitate that. In the communication, it's important to anchor it in what should be obvious, that this is an emergency measure taken during these pandemic conditions, and it's not a permanent change in practice or policy. So it seems obvious, but I think it is important to be thoughtful about each of those things because at this point, everyone is being very, very flexible, which I think is great, and I think really speaks to the great culture of organizations. It's something that people will remember forever, how their company reacted to this, and they will be grateful for those companies that reacted in a thoughtful, humane way. But when communicating that reaction, it's got to be clear that you're doing this given the emergency nature of the circumstances.
Yeah, to that, I find that really interesting, and maybe not something that to both of your points that a lot of organizations are really thinking about. And one thing that kind of struck me as you were talking about it was just, I think you had great advice around, talking about it's temporary, this is an emergency situation, but how should, as the CHRO is sort of working to kind of develop policies and working with the rest of the C-suite on this, how should they be interacting with their counsel? Like, what should that relationship be like right now? And maybe Melody, you could provide some ideas around this. Should they be running everything by them? Should they be working hand in hand on this? Like, what should that sort of relationship be like right now?
Yes to all that. It has to be hand in glove. If there's ever, ideally, the head of HR and the chief legal counsel, external or internal, depending on size and how the company is structured, they will work hand in glove on everything of note. That's the ideal relationship. In a situation like this, it is essential. There is nothing that is too small or too minor for one of them to not talk to the other about, because of all the factors that we've just discussed and many more that we don't have time to discuss on this webinar. So the constant flow of information and thought partnership across those two individuals I cannot overstate the importance.
Yeah, the other thing I would add to that is that not only is the medical and public health situation constantly in flux, but so is the legal situation. So at the time of this recording, you've got the House of Representatives has passed relief legislation that includes some pretty significant changes to the Family and Medical Leave Act, some paid leave requirements, and you have a number of states and localities that have enacted or are considering similar types of legislation that change paid or unpaid leave requirements, for example. And so that's something that you're going to want to be up to speed on as you're making these dynamic changes with respect to your workforce. Pay, hours, location of work, all of that is affected by what is a rapidly changing not only health situation, but legal backdrop as well.
Yep. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think you guys have really sort of sketched out in a great way the potential pitfalls that organizations will have here. I want to talk a little bit about sort of thinking a little bit about business continuity and sort of making sure that we're, just in terms of how even workforces are working right now. So in a lot of organizations now, more and more of the work is going remotely. And in the past, it might be part of your organization, had some work from home arrangements, but now we're seeing entire organizations, for example, who are essentially, in a kind of a virtual workplace. Just really curious, as we're thinking about what we need to think about in terms of legal protections, in terms of also how do we, ensure that we're continuing to serve customers in more of a virtual workplace. Any kind of advice on how to think about, what are some of the risks, and how do we manage that as our organizations are becoming, essentially virtual organizations.
Jason, I'm going to let you jump in on that one first.
Sure, absolutely. So I think there are a number of different issues to think about, right? In terms of employment law, there are lots of wage and hour issues, unfortunately, that you've got to think about if you have workers who are remote, including what hours are they on the clock, if they're hourly, are they getting their meal and rest breaks, in a number of states ensuring that they're getting reimbursed for quote-unquote reasonable and necessary business expenses, which might, for example, include things like home Wi-Fi, internet service. So all of that you've got to think about. You need to think about security of information, so both in terms of the transmission of the information, how are people connecting remotely, what equipment are they using, and also who's around when they are, for example, on a video conference or something like that from home. On the other hand, this is a nutty situation that we've never faced before, and so I think you're going to have to show a degree of flexibility that you wouldn't otherwise show and count on people to use their common sense and good judgment. I think the biggest practical issue that is popping up now, and I think we're going to see more and more of, is making sure that all of the tools that we're using work on the scale that we now need to use them. Conference lines, video conference capability, all of these things that now are reliant on or being relied on to carry huge volumes of traffic, and also relying on home internet and cell connections. You've got to give some thought to what kind of support you're going to have for that and what kind of backup and contingency plans you have in order to deliver services to your customers and clients, because it's not simple and easy like it used to be.
Yeah, not a lot to add to that other than just, from a very practical standpoint, having the HR team put together, and I'm sure most of them already have done this, but the key is keeping them updated as different things and rules and guidelines and what must be done versus what you thought had to be done, but now based on the most recent legislation passed in your jurisdiction no longer has to be done, or you were sure it didn't have to be and now it does have to be. Having a set of written guidelines as people are working at home and navigating the new world is something that is important to do and important to keep updated. And then, as Jason says, and recognizing, all that said, that this is an incredibly fluid situation like none other that we've ever been in. And so, giving people a hall pass for things that are just outside their control is going to be a necessary part of the overall way that we approach the situation.
Yeah, makes sense. So to that end, around an unprecedented situation, Melody, one thing that we're seeing, and I know we've talked about this, is employees responding in very different ways to the crisis. From being very terrified to being kind of cavalier about it, which is putting some stress on the workforce, potentially leading to some inconsistencies in how things are being sort of applied. So how do you think about managing a workplace, with a lot of different, it kind of gets to the uncertainty argument we were talking about a little bit more, but with sort of a lot of different, responses that you get from different individuals around the seriousness of what's going on?
Yeah, this has been a lot of the conversations I've been in across the past week or so, in particular, as we're a little bit moving into phase 2, maybe even phase 3 of the festivities. I think you do have that appearing in many workforces, running the gamut from really a high degree of concern on one end to a fairly cavalier approach on the other end across the employee base, and tensions have been running high, even if you're in a company that is on a mandatory work from home and teams are dispersed across the cyberspace as they're working day to day and doing whatever their jobs are to serve customers and get the washout. That's not a constant thing. It's not an 8, 9, 10 hour constant requirement, and there is side chatter in message systems and on emails and whatnot, with employees actually getting upset and angry with team members around their respective attitudes. And so I think one of the things that it's important to do is to, as a leader in the company, whether it's HR or any of the senior roles in the company, is to realize this is real. This is happening. To Jason's point, it might start to normalize a bit or to regress to the mean a little bit as people pay more attention to CDC guidance as the situation becomes a little more clear. I think we're all probably aware at this point that the next couple of weeks are a pretty significant inflection point for us in terms of taking steps to not overwhelm the medical system. And I think you may see some normalization of attitudes and opinions, but in the meantime, it's important for senior leaders to take a very balanced, very measured, non-panicked, but very clear view that this is not the time for any kind of focus internally. We need to respect our teammates, and we need to focus on what we can do for the customer, what we can do for ourselves in terms of mental health and physical health within the comfort zone that each person has, and to be respectful and mindful that not everybody comes from the same experience or has the same experience, but we as a company are going to do what we can to keep one another and the communities safe and healthy.
Well said.
Jason, what would you add to that from just a more of the, what is required point of view?
Yeah, I think that was actually perfectly captured. The only other thing I would emphasize, and not necessarily from what is legally required, but just what I think makes good sense is, this is really a time for leadership, as you pointed out, and now more than ever, it's always the case that employees have a million things going on and lots of pressures coming at them, both inside and outside the workplace, that we've got to be sensitive to. Now that's magnified by 1,000, right? You've got your employees are maybe at home, or if they're not at home, if they've got kids, all the kids are home. So they're trying to figure out what to do there. Whatever caregiving arrangements they have are probably not working. They may have older relatives who are sick or at risk. They've got all sorts of complications and pressures and fears that make it very, very difficult for them to focus on their job. And simple things matter, even so much as the leader of a team saying thank you to everybody and understanding about what's going on and all the pressures they face, and, the dog barking in the back of the conference call. It's a silly little thing, but it's also an indication of the pressure that somebody is under. And a little bit of kindness, I think, and a little bit of culture will go a very long way in this environment. And so I think that's something that, as senior leaders are enmeshed in bigger decisions about how to deal with this, don't forget the day-to-day and the expression of appreciation and outreach and virtual human touch to your teams. I think extraordinarily important at this point, as a human matter and, as a matter of employee retention and legal risk.
And that's one of those precedents you actually want to set.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Absolutely. One final question, and then we'll wrap up here. Just wanted to you had mentioned, Melody. We're in the second wave, maybe even close to the third wave. No one's got a crystal ball here, in terms of like where all of this is going. We've got information coming in. We're listening to the authorities or to the experts. We are paying close attention, but. Any thoughts, just over the horizon around what might be some of the third wave, issues, either Jason or Melody, that you would imagine sort of coming down the pipeline that, maybe aren't urgent today, but might be urgent, within a short period of time?
I think one thing that does come to mind is that if this turns into a protracted situation, and it may, I think this idea of isolation of people, who are used to a social office environment, I think that we'd all be well advised to remember that this could get more and more and more difficult for people. And setting up virtual ways to continue to foster interaction that is not necessarily focused entirely on the work, but on just reconnecting the teams, reconnecting the manager with the teams, getting senior leadership out in front of, big swaths of the employee staff. Those are things that are going to be, I think, increasingly important the longer this extends. And related to that, I think coming up with some creative, unique ways to get content out in front of employees, push things out about, how to make interesting exercise type routines in your own spare room or things like that, or just, creative ways to interact, virtual book clubs, whatever it is, giving more thought to, if this becomes protracted, mental health is actually going to be more of an issue, and how can we, as senior leaders, how can we as organizations take some care around that for our employees? Thank you, Melody.
Yes, mental health. I think a lot of folks are early on in working remotely, and then much more potentially to come, and to your point, going to be a bigger and bigger issue for organizations to manage. So I want to thank both of you for your insights. I'm sure that our CHRO and HR executive listeners are going to be able to put a lot of these ideas into practice, in addition to being inspired by a lot of the words that you guys had today, and a lot of the thoughts that you had as well. You can find this show on demand, along with all of the resources mentioned today, on our website at execonline.com, Virtual Uncertainty. We hope you enjoyed this discussion, and hope you'll join us on Thursday as we connect with industry expert Dory Clark to learn more practical tools available for your leaders as we all move into this new virtual environment.